You know, I've received a lot of requests over the years to talk more about chainsaws, chainsaw maintenance, and what types of tools I like to use. And for the most part, I don't like to get into that too much. But Kyle had a request today, so he grabbed my camera and I went ahead and put something together. So I'm going to share this with you. Hopefully you'll find it valuable. Hopefully you'll understand it, because I kind of yammer on a little bit. But here's some of my thoughts on chainsaws and chainsaw maintenance. There's an old saw. It's a still 1015 AV. I'm guessing this saw is from the 70s. I got it at a garage sale. There was fuel in it, sat for a long time. I gave it to my friend Kyle, and he went through and cleaned everything out, put it all back together, and then he had a hard time starting it. Put fresh fuel in here. So this is kind of a rule of thumb for most chainsaws, that the carburetor adjustment is really important to understand, but you can also screw it up. So in this case, you've got a high and you've got a low, and then you've got an idle screw. The idle adjustment, don't worry about the idle adjustment too much yet. So you got the high and the low, so down and through here. That's what you play with for more fuel, more air, basically. So you've also got a choke, and this has got a real funky choke that sticks out. That's probably why they discontinued this saw, because branches will break that off. Now, when you go to start a saw that's been sitting for a long time, there's a couple things that you got to do. I usually recommend pulling it over a few times, then taking the spark plug out and looking to see if you're getting fuel in there. Also checking to see if you've got spark. How do you check for spark? Well, you can take that spark plug out and you can ground it somewhere on the frame with a screwdriver, and very carefully go over and pull it through carefully and see if you get a little spark in the screwdriver. There's a few ways of doing it. You can hold on to the plug and pull it over and see if it shocks you really good. That's a good way to do it. Try that. Now seriously, now to get something like this started that's been sitting for a long time, there's a couple things that you want to do. Most people will put it down on the ground, put their foot down in here, and go like this. I find that difficult because you don't have as much of a pull. I'm more experienced, so I like to drop start my saws. If you're inexperienced with chainsaws, put it on the ground. If you're experienced with chainsaws, you're going to find all pros will start their saw from the air. And it's called a drop start. It's where you pull, but you're letting the weight of the saw go down and get it going as well. So I just started this thing, but let me go through the procedure. If it was sitting for a long time, I would choke it after I've checked the spark plug. Make sure it's got new fuel, everything's going on it. Make sure that your switch is on, because if your switch is off and you sit there and pull and pull and pull and pull, you just flood it out. And then you'll turn the switch back on. You'll have a bitch of a time get it to start. So make sure that that's on. Sounds ridiculous. Make sure your brake is off. I'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, because once you get this thing to start, you're going to want to rev it up. You don't want to just start it up and sit it at idle. You want to clear it out. That's really, really important. So right now, I've got it in a choke position, and I give it a... Okay, come over here closer and I'll show you what I'm doing. First off, when you start the saw, back up just a little bit. You see how I'm holding it against my leg? That's really a safer position than sitting there going like this and messing with it, because you've got 3 points. You've got your handle here, you got your handle here, you got a flat here. This is out of the way. Once it gets started, that's a good, comfortable position to rev it up, and be very, very aware that nobody's around you when you do this. So I started it up on the choke position. When I open it all the way up, it dies. When it's all the way choked, it's dying. The only place that it works is midway. What does that tell you? Well, you've got the high and the low here, that's fuel and air. So if I've got it choked and it starts, but it won't keep running, well, it shouldn't keep running, and you give it a little bit of air and it goes, and then you give it all the air and it dies, that tells you that you've got too much air going in or too much fuel. So how do you know which one to adjust? How do you pull it down? Well, you've got these little set screws down here, and what I usually do is I set them all the way down, but I count. I count the number of turns so I know where it's at. So typically these screws, depending upon the saw, every saw is different, are like 1.5 times open, and they should be fairly even. So by turning them down all the way, you count them, and then you back them up to where they were, and you try to balance them out. Then you start it. But when you're in the field and you've got to mess with these things, you've got to know what's wrong. You've got to know what's missing. But the initial start, I think you've got a good saw here. Once you play with the carburetor adjustments and get that tuned in, then it should run. But you want it to run high revolutions when you're sitting there on a standstill. Now finally, here's one last point that I want to make that's really, really critical. Chainsaws with chain brakes are wonderful, but the chain brake can be a source of destroying your saw. I can't tell you how many times I've seen guys ruin their saws because the chain brake was set, but it was maybe not quite tight enough to totally stop the saw. And they sit there and they rev and they rev and they rev and they go and they start working, and what's happening is the brake is heating up. It's going round and round, heating up and heating up and heating up. And that friction on that chain brake can actually heat everything up inside. It'll melt plastic, it'll melt metal, it'll melt all kinds of things because that's just an incredible amount of friction. So be really careful. If you start the saw, personally, I always start it with the chain brake off because I immediately want to start revving it up to clear it out. If you start it up with the chain brake on, like they say in the books, the safety guys, and everything's perfect, you can sit there and let it idle and idle and idle, but take the chain brake off when you need to clear it out and make sure that you get it running. You can't have it both ways. So there's safety, which is smart. There's function, which is absolute. And you've got to kind of meet it somewhere in the middle. So those are some real basic safety things. Finally, this chain, let's come over here, is too tight. All right, feel that. Just a hair too tight. It's running, and as long as everything inside this bar is being lubricated, it'll be good. But if it gets a little bit of buildup of stuff in there, then that'll bog down as well, and then you can heat up the bar. So it shouldn't be sagging where it's flopping out of there, but there should be, when you have it like this, there should be a little airspace underneath here. It should be down about like that naturally. If it's uptight all the way around, that can be a problem. Lubrication is really important to keep this thing lubed. Fine. Okay, here's another thing that a lot of people screw up on. This saw right here is in reasonable good, this bar right here is in reasonable good shape. But if you have a close-up, you see my thumb right there? See, can you hear that? I shouldn't be catching anything. When you go up to the edge, it should be smooth. That's good, that's good. That's good, but right there, there's one little spot. That means there's a little bit of a burr on the bar. And if an exaggerated thing would be like a burr that comes up from the metal heating up and mushrooming over. Because the bar is just a fraction of an inch thinner than the thickness of the cut, it'll clear out all the sawdust. But if you have a burr on the bar, that burr is going to drag on the inside of the cut. And if the burr is on one side, your saw is going to cut crooked. I also noticed that this chain is dull. Let's put it in the sun here and see if I can show you this. Here, come look over my shoulder, see if you can see this. Well, it's kind of hard to see right now, but I looked at it and I could see that this edge right here was visible. This line, the cut line, should be so clean that you shouldn't be able to see any shininess on that edge. The key is to hold your thumb up there and you can feel it. I can tell blind if a chainsaw is sharp or dull. This one's so dull I wouldn't use it. So there's a few key components. Keep your saw clean, keep your air filter clean. Make sure you've got the chain sharpened. I can talk about rakers, I can talk about all kinds of other stuff, but at the end of the day, Oh, fuel. The saw shops all say to run high octane fuel rather than the cheapest stuff. And in California, I know that we've got a lot of ethanol and stuff in the fuel, and I don't know if that's true or false, but I'll take what the saw shop says as a good rule of thumb. So make sure that you get the mix right, use a good quality 2-cycle oil, and keep it clean. You know, a lot of guys run the saws for so long that you get all this buildup of crap inside there, and that, you know, that also creates friction, not to mention additional weight. So let's see if we can get this thing to start again. Yeah. Hear it? Wide open. Okay, I'll have to cut that out. I can't remember what I said on that one.
Stop. Cut.